titled it The Value of Oyster Farming, but I'm going to talk about sort of issues surrounding 208 planning for municipal projects and also delving into some of the economic impacts that are potentially on the horizon for implementing projects like that. So I'll start out with a short video. This is just some drone footage to sort of give you an idea of the scale of what's going on in Wellfleet. Wellfleet's one of the biggest oyster producers in the state. Produces around 10 to 12 million oysters a year. It competes with Barnstable and Duxbury as the top producers in the state, all producing relatively similar numbers, sort of varies year to year. What you're seeing here is a beach called Indian Neck Beach. So this represents only 30% of the aquaculture licensed sites in the town of Wellfleet. So Wellfleet was an oyster town from when before it was found by European settlers. There were massive reefs all over the harbor. It was actually a navigational hazard to enter the harbor of Wellfleet. That was all decimated in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And the modern aquaculture system in Wellfleet began in the 70s, so it's one of the older aquaculture towns also. So these farms you're seeing, the average farm size in Wellfleet's about 2.5 acres per grant, and there's about 180 license holders. Some of them share licenses. Licensing grant is an interchangeable word. These grants will be about 2 to 3 times bigger by late summer, early fall. Because this was taken in spring. So you're getting new seed, you're breaking down your densities, there's a lot of handling involved. 180 farmers, but also their employees, so thousands and thousands of man hours to produce that 10 million oysters. And 10 million oysters is not a lot of oysters when you think about it. And when you start thinking about nitrogen reduction, it takes a lot of animals, as Josh was saying, to actually meet metrics for nitrogen mitigation. And so the first thing I'll talk about is reef restoration, because I think it's an enticing idea, like the idea that you can put oysters on the ground, plant them on the ground, they'll become a self-sustaining ecosystem, they catch their own oysters, they require little input, not as much labor, no gear involved, but there are several issues when it comes to siting an oyster reef particularly. One, and the most important one, is that you need to have a mass of oysters in that water body that can produce enough larvae that you can reliably catch a set on the reef. Otherwise, you're just planting oysters on the ground and crossing your fingers and hoping they all live, and you have to keep doing that forever. So it's not really a reef. So it takes getting to that volume. And then even if you do get to that volume, there's no guarantee that you're going to reliably catch that set, because there's 3 towns that I mentioned before, Wellfleet, Duxbury, and Barnstable, with a similar amount of oysters produced each year. So they all have that volume of oyster in the water, but only one town catches a set of oysters reliably, and that's Wellfleet. And, I'm not a scientist, so what I say will be relatively anecdotal, but as a farmer, we pay attention to what's going on around us. And this is actually a reef that's on my grant that we propagate every year. And we lose up to 70% of it a year sometimes, and it can take 2 to 3 years to sort of come back. And that can be due to ice, that can be due to dermo, that can be due to too much sand flow where the wind will bury it too deep and it can't actually come back up in the spring. So several reasons why it sort of fails, and then we rebuild it. And we do that because we have bycatch, we have excess seed, we can propagate it with that sort of thing, and then we catch a set on it also. So fortunate enough to be able to do that. So one of the other key differences about Wellfleet and Duxbury and Barnstable is our orientation to the predominant wind. And this is what I think plays a major role, because in Wellfleet we have a harbor that faces southwest, and that's the predominant wind in the summer. The oysters spawn in around late June, early July, and that spawn sits on the sea surface primarily at first. And so if you have a heavy wind blowing southwest, that's going to keep that water in the harbor. That larvae has a chance to stay in the harbor and set on stuff. Whereas someplace like Duxbury and Barnstable, their harbor's oriented the opposite way, and the wind could be blowing it out. And this is not something that I've studied. It's just something that we know in Wellfleet. If the wind blows northeast real hard after they spawn, we're probably not going to catch a set. And you can see right here, this is wild caught seed. This is stuff that we caught in Wellfleet. These are on these discs called Chinese hats. We dip them in a cement mix with lime and sand and put those out in the water around a week from now and cross our fingers, and reliably we catch a set. And that was a couple years ago, that set. And we're one of the few towns that you can do that in Massachusetts. I don't even know if there is another one, to be honest with you. But to reliably catch like that. So even if you have all these conditions to create a reef, and Wellfleet, I would say, is a perfect place to do that. We've had 2 reef projects that have been implemented in Wellfleet. One was a pilot project for a 208 plan, and the other one was done by the Audubon to just create a reef for the sake of creating a reef. Both of those projects ultimately failed due to weather events and disease, and they were not able to sustain and create an ecosystem. And so I think there is a place for reef restoration, but probably not in nitrogen mitigation because it's so unreliable. It's just, you need to meet metrics. That's the point of nitrogen mitigation. You're trying to have consistency to meet metrics. So if you're not doing that, what's the point really? So then obviously there's aquaculture. That's my daughter. She works on the farm with us sometimes. And aquaculture is obviously a more viable technique. You have controls. You're growing stuff in gear. You're buying a certain amount of seed. You know what you're getting, right? But there's a lot of inputs involved. Seed procurement's a major issue. We just had a hatchery email us the other day. They said, we're only going to be able to get you 50% of our seed. We had 20 million larvae died. We don't know why. We're trying to figure it out. And then you get a little nervous. Well, is my half a seed going to be viable by the time I get it? What happened to it? So those sorts of things are issues. And that has a downstream effect where if you call the next hatchery, they're like, I'm getting blown up right now. I can't talk to you. Like, everyone wants seed because the seed market's actually extremely tight. It's like there's not a lot of room for a hatchery failure. And it has downstream effects because that's income from 2 years from now, right? So that's one issue. The other issue with aquaculture is just the actual amount of labor. People don't realize that you're practicing animal husbandry, right? You have to keep these animals at low enough densities that they are healthy. They're not overcrowded. And they can perform the ecosystem services that oysters do, which is a great thing. But unhealthy oysters are vectors for disease. Dermo is a disease that spreads from oyster to oyster when it dies. So if you are keeping your bags at too high a density, you're not breaking them down, you're not handling them well, you create a vector for spreading disease to other oysters in the area. And so that's one issue. So when you talk about scaling it up, let's just talk about 1 million oysters. That requires about 1,000 rebar racks and about 6,000 grow bags. Probably a little bit more than that, but to produce that many, you're gonna need somewhere along those lines. And then you need the manpower to handle all those oysters through their life cycle to get to a legal oyster. So although it may seem simple and it may seem like a viable solution and there are controls, you also still have the risk of losing crop. And you can easily lose 2 years of crop in one cycle because you have your seed out there and you have your oysters out there. And that's happened to us twice where we've lost close to 70% of our crop just to unknown circumstances, really. 1 year, probably dermo, and then a poor overwintering, But you don't know because honestly, farming's just not consistent. And that's one of the things that we're talking about when you're talking about putting oysters into a plan that relies on meeting metrics. So these are the kind of issues that really come to the forefront. And then, as Josh talked about, the market. If we do have an aquaculture nitrogen mitigation project that is successful. Let's say everything's going well. And as you scale these things up to meet your metrics, what happens to the end use of the oyster? Where does it go? Because the oyster industry is highly susceptible to market disruptions because, as I said before, these are small. This is a cottage industry. This is all small farms. The way Massachusetts set up its aquaculture industry was through home rule, basically. Each municipality can determine how they want to run their aquaculture through the state. And most towns have decided to keep it very small, a cottage industry. So we don't have economies of scale. We have small family farms that are operating with low margins and often, rely on month-to-month income, depending on how large they are, whether they can weather a market disruption for 1 or 2 months. And we did have an issue with one pilot project. I forget what year it was, probably 2018, I want to say, where I think it was Lonnie's Pond. There was oysters that were done for a pilot project for nitrogen mitigation. It wasn't a ton of oysters, but it was significant enough. They weren't intended to get into the commercial market, but they wound up in there, and it decimated the market for a month. And then it took a long time for that to recover because once the price gets depressed, I mean, you couldn't sell an oyster for more than 35 cents at that time. And then once that price goes down, you're in a time where there's high supply. So getting that price back up is very difficult because there's already too much supply on the market. And so that really hurt a lot of small family farms at that time. For us, we grow a large enough scale that we could kind of just back out and just wait it out because our cost of production is somewhere around 35 cents to 40 cents, depending on the year and the mortality, to grow an oyster with all the gear and labor and everything else. So you just can't really sell them for less than they cost to grow, or you're not going to stay in business for very long. This is my final slide, basically. I probably talked too fast. 2 minutes, perfect. Okay. So basically the question is, as municipal projects scale up, if this becomes something that's sort of more widespread, more towns decide they want to implement 208 plans that incorporate oyster aquaculture, are the economic implications being considered? Is there some planning around unintended consequences? Because Cape Cod has a lot of producers, and it is a small economic engine. I mean, it's not a huge industry, but it's big for us, right? And, the other question really is whether when you add all these inputs and the inconsistency of growing a bivalve to reduce nitrogen and all the costs associated with that, is it really much more beneficial than treating the contaminant at its source and not relying on these to treat nitrogen in the water? And so there is a place for it, and it's a beautiful thing that they provide this ecosystem service. But in my opinion, and it's just my opinion, that this type of thing should be used ancillary to 208 plans as a contingency, right? If your 208 plan's not going very well, but you have aquaculture going on in your water that's naturally doing the things that aquaculture does, which is naturally reducing nitrogen, clearing the water, and doing that, I think that makes a whole lot more sense than trying to rely on it to meet metrics for a 208 plan. And I guess I will leave it at that. Time is up. Okay. So if anybody has any questions, just about whatever, Derma or...
Hey, Mike, I serve on the state shellfish panel with Mike. We've had a lot of these discussions. You talk about the price going down to the point where you no longer could make a profit, and there would be some concern that eventually the small growers would find it in their interest basically to sell out to a larger entity, so they would take over 10 brands, you know. Acme Oyster, you know, would come in. And it has some historical precedent because that happened in Chatham 50 years ago. ARC took over a lot of the historic brands. So has Wellfleet taken any steps to maintain the kind of, you know, small individual brand that you have?
So every town manages their shellfish however they want to. Wellfleet has kind of an interesting system where they allow 4 people to be named on a license. And so they're shared. Once another person's listed on a license, they have to both agree in order to allow another person to be listed on the license. So it kind of makes it difficult to do anything like that. Technically, you can't sell a license. You can sell a business, but there's a maximum license size. So you can only hold up to 7 acres in Wellfleet. Some acres it's 3, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 2. You're never going to get a 7-acre license in Wellfleet probably because there's just so much competition to even be in there. So the town is generally committed to keeping it small, and it's been regulated that way for a long time. And so the only licenses that are big are ones that existed prior to 1996, I think, when they put the 7-acre limit on. So I don't see that as much of a threat, really. But I suppose one of the issues is if, you know, there's too many oysters on the market, it becomes non-viable, then do people just start backing out of the industry or scaling down production and hobby farming again? And, you know, Josh showed that slide that said 50 cents in 2004, was it? Well, I can tell you, it goes back to like 1998. It was 50 cents because that's when my uncle, I used to work with my uncle, he got 50 cents then. So, yeah, it hasn't changed much. So I don't know, but I don't think there's a big threat of big companies moving in and consolidating just because of the way that the industry has been set up in Massachusetts.
This is a naive question probably, and maybe
No.
for more than just you. But is the reason to consider an oyster or aquaculture with an end like market as part of these plans is that you have the kind of plus side of that you have industry and money coming out of it?
I think that, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The reason I ask that is when I think about these projects, you know, we're doing marsh restoration, you're not doing that for an economic industry, you're doing that to do the work. You could do a shellfish bed restoration with like a ribbed mussel, say, and not compete and have the benefit, but you don't get that potential, I guess, benefit.
Yeah, I think that DEP wants to see the oysters removed to get the nitrogen credit. And so then it's like, well, where do you put them, basically, to get the credits? I think that there has been some discussion about like sort of reef restoration or using other animals and then trying to figure out how much nitrogen they're removing becomes an issue. I mean, I guess you can kind of like do per square meter how many live animals there are, but when they die, how much nitrogen are they releasing back into the water column? So I think there has to be some clear metric that's set for valuing the amount of nitrogen removal, and I think that's probably why that concern comes in. So, yeah.
Well, what about the natural ecosystems? Other things eat them, and if they restore the bed to the natural form, wouldn't shellfish and other things come and eat them, and then somebody wants to remove those, and indirectly they're removing the oysters?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of potential for like siting reef restoration if you can find a place where it actually works and holds. It creates biodiversity. There's a lot of good purposes for that. I just don't know if nitrogen mitigation under a 208 plan where you have to meet metrics is really the best use for that type of thing. But in water bodies that are close to harvest, we've talked a little bit in the State Shellfish Advisory Panel about trying to work with the state to allow that to happen so that they can actually clear water that is, quote unquote, you know, not suitable for harvest. Right now that's restricted by the state. They don't allow any oyster propagation in an area where water bodies are closed to the harvest of shellfish. Have time one more? One more. Okay, go ahead.
Has there been any discussion of biodiversity credits to the farmer? Did you say?
Well, I don't know about that. That's something that's been, I think, brought up by the governor has recently instituted a sort of an executive order, I think, to increase biodiversity in ebayments in Cape Cod Bay, I think. Maybe it's just all ebayments in Massachusetts. But I don't think there's any metrics being used. I think it's Mass Fish and Game that is supposed to implement that, and they don't really have the bandwidth to do that yet. So there hasn't been any discussion about that I know of, but it may be down the road. But really, we're here to talk about nitrogen. So, yeah, okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.